Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the FASEBICOGR webinar on understanding federal versus institutional requirements for animal research. We will get started here in the next couple minutes as everyone continues to trickle in. As a reminder, you can access the slides. If you go to the right hand of your screen, there is a handout box. If you just expand that, you can feel free to download the slides and print them in order to follow along. Thank you. We'll get started soon. All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's now 2 o'clock, so I guess that means we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to part 2 of our series with Council of Government Relations in conjunction with FASEB, Understanding Federal versus Institutional Requirements for Animal Research. If you were with us last week, we looked at the institutional and agency perspective, and now we are going to look at the researcher and scientist perspective. So here with me today, I am thrilled to have Dr. J.R. Haywood, who is a former FASEB president and assistant vice president in the Office of Regulatory Affairs at Michigan State University. He is also a former member of the ALAC Council. I also have with me Ms. Molly Green. She is an IACUC advisor for over 30 years at Michigan State University and is also an ad hoc ALAC Council member. And finally, we have Dr. Galen Edwards, who is the chair of the Animal Care and Use Committee for over 20 years at the University of Georgia and is the current VP of the ALAC Council. So I want to remind everybody that at the end we will have a few minutes to ask some questions and answers for our speakers, and I want to remind you how to do that. You write your question here in this white box, click send, and I will again remind you how to do this at the end. But just so you are aware, we will have time for questions and answers. All right, so for the agenda today, we are going to look at a few of the surveys that have assessed burden on faculty and scientists to kind of get us started. And then we will look at what specifically faculty and scientists can do to affect this change. And then we will dive into the actual IACUC issues and get into the nitty-gritty details. Of course, followed by our Q&A. So with that, let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, so thank you, Naomi. I'm J.R. Haywood, and Naomi introduced me from Michigan State University. I'd like to give a special thanks to FASEB and COGR for sponsoring this webinar and last week's webinar. Last week, Eric Tomasi and Sally Thompson-Haratani, Betty Goldentire, and Axel Wolf presented how IACUC staff could do their work a little bit differently to reduce institutional burden in animal care programs based on the findings of the Council on Government Relations Institutional Survey report. This week, Molly Green, Galen Edwards, and I will offer some suggestions that researchers might want to consider on how to engage with their IACUC and to help affect change to reduce institutional burdens. This discussion is based on two premises. First, that researchers as key stakeholders in an animal care program should be active participants in the institutional discussions that determine the procedures of how the IACUC and animal care program work. But this is only possible if researchers understand the regulations and the policies governing the oversight of animal research and engage in the discussion. The second premise is that at least 5 national studies have been conducted in the last decade and that have been directed at researchers, asking them to identify which specific administrative and research-related burdens are most onerous. And it's these results that have led to the Council on Government Relations survey. So one of these studies, if I could see the next slide, please. One of these studies was conducted by the Federal Demonstration Partnership. And this slide actually shows the results of 2 separate surveys, one conducted in 2012 and one in 2018. As you can see, the individuals who use animals and thus experience the IACUC and animal subjects related burdens have reported the greatest substantial time actually spent on administrative duties. These observations, where investigators have the perception, even the feeling, that administrative workload is excessive, has resulted in the subsequent questioning of IACUC processes in institutions across the country and the survey that we're going to discuss today. So I'm going to turn to my colleague, Galen Edwards. And Galen, sometimes discussions about reducing regulatory burden are confused with a disregard for animal welfare. Could you comment on that?
Well, as pointed out last week, the reducing burden does not equate to reducing animal welfare. In the slide that Sally Thompson-Iritani produced, it does allow more resources for animal care and enrichment, more time for scientists to practice science. But I would also add that it allows more time for the IACUC to review high-risk protocols. The IACUC also gets tied up with burden, and reducing their burden is an important consideration as well.
Thank you. That last point is, I think, a key point. Well, if we turn our attention to the survey, yes, this slide, the 2018 survey of COGR member institutions on actions that they can take to reduce administrative burden associated with animal research was conducted. It consisted of 21 questions, so it was a manageable survey, and that's probably why 94 of the institutions actually responded. The principal results of the survey were that institutions are more likely to take action to reduce administrative burden when federal agencies provide clear directives and address uncertainty. Secondly, agencies could provide significant assistance to institutions by distinguishing between requirements and best practices. And I'd like to insert here that in fact last week we heard representatives of the agencies give good advice and help clarify some points of confusion for the listeners of the webinar. And I'd also like to point out that the agencies, I think, have been working hard in recent years to work with the scientific community to help reduce burden. So we're making progress. The final observation was that a contributing factor is the complexity of the multiple sets of regulations and policies and guidelines that we all have to deal with. And again, the agencies have taken steps to help us align these requirements so that they're more similar between agencies. And we expect more to come on this particular issue. So today, the topics that are going to be discussed are protocol review processes, frequency of reviews, animal numbers, and literature review. So, Molly, you've had over 30 years experience as an IACUC administrator in various roles. Could you review for us the three methods of protocol review?
Thanks, JR, and thanks, Naomi and FASEB. So in the regulations, they outline two specific ways of reviewing protocols, and then they've just introduced a third process. So the primary and the default is called Designated Member Review, or DMR. It allows the IACUC chair to designate one or more qualified member of the IACUC to review a protocol, to approve, or request modifications to approve. Once the modifications have been reviewed, the designated member reviewer can approve the protocol. Most institutions include several IACUC members and/or subject matter experts in this review process. For instance, at Michigan State University, we can have as many as 6 or 7 people look at every protocol to ensure the quality of the review. The next method outlined in the regulations is called full committee review. It comes into play 4 ways. Under the regulations, any member of the committee may request full committee review of a protocol. And I'm sorry, by that I mean everybody comes to a meeting, you have a quorum of the membership present at the meeting, and you sit around a table and talk about the protocol and vote on it. The second one, disapproval of a protocol is not allowed under designated member review. So if those reviewing under DMR are unable to come to a satisfactory conclusion, or too many questions remain, they may request full committee review of the protocol. Third, many institutions have developed a triage system in which protocols automatically go to full committee review. As in, the principal investigator submits the protocol, it is unrelieved pain and distress, for instance, or major multiple survival surgeries, or whatever category, it automatically is going to be reviewed by the full committee. Some institutions, this is my 4th bullet, some institutions send all protocols to full committee review regardless of the level of invasiveness. And I understand some reasons why they do that. Some reasons I don't quite understand, but one thing you might look at your institution is to calculate the cost of a meeting by the take quorum of people sitting around the table and what does it cost. When I was working at the medical school in San Antonio, I did this assessment. It was $1,000 an hour to have a protocol meeting, IACUC meeting. So thirdly is this new way of reviewing amendments. The VVC, or Veterinary Verification and Consultation, only applies to amendments submitted or modifications submitted to the IACUC. Until the summer of 2014, all amendments were processed using either DMR or FCR. That August, OLA, in agreement with the USDA, published a revised process for reviewing changes to active studies. We will discuss this very important VVC process in a few minutes. Next slide.
Yeah, thank you, Molly. So the first results of the COGR survey are shown here. They revealed that 66% of the institutions do use designated member review as the default, but 29% of the institutions were not even planning to implement it. So, Galen, this raises the question, the issue, that some institutions don't believe that designated member review is adequate, or at least suggest that. So in your 20 plus years of experience, why don't you talk about this a little bit? I mean, is designated member review as effective as full committee review?
Well, I certainly think it's just as effective, and it has some important characteristics that everybody needs to remember. One, qualified members to do the DMR process are assigned, as Molly pointed out. And you can also appoint an ad hoc reviewer that's a subject matter expert if you want more input on that protocol and still have it go through the DMR process. The DMR process is much more efficient. Protocols get approved faster, which means the scientists, the PIs, get onto their projects more quickly. The other thing it does for the IACUC is it allows the IACUC more time to discuss at full committee review those difficult high-risk protocols. So if I have an infectious disease study that we have to discuss endpoints at length, it allows us significant time or sufficient time to do that. And the last thing I would add is Molly pointed out the dollar cost of having long IACUC meetings. I would also point out that when you have a 3 or 4 hour IACUC meeting, by hour 3 and 4, the attention span of the committee is waning rapidly. So really having efficient meetings that you can focus on the high-risk protocols is critical.
Okay, so what you're saying is designated member review gives us a good quality review, but perhaps even more importantly, it provides the opportunity for the IACUC to discuss those difficult protocols in greater depth.
Absolutely.
With greater attention. Great, thank you. So let's move on to the next slide. The next slide is the veterinary verification consultation. The survey survey results indicated that 77% of the institutions have adopted this process, and 13% do not plan to adopt it. So since its introduction in 2014, it's taken on some gravitas, so to speak, and people are seeing some value in it. So Molly, can you explain the process to us a little bit and talk about what value it brings to animal oversight?
I think part of the slowness of institutions to adopt this is we were totally taken by surprise. We go, wow, this is awesome. In fact, I called Susan Silk at OLA that day and I said, this is a game changer. This is such a welcome change. So the VVC process was implemented and encouraged by OLA and USDA to support expedited review of procedures already approved by the IACUC. It can significantly decrease the number of changes and amendments the IACUC needs to review because we have this other way of reviewing them that allows the science to keep on going. As the slide says, it's procedures already approved by the IACUC. You cannot add new procedures. Part of the reason for not going to VVC, as I understand it, was some institutions were having problems with their PIs demanding this, that, and the other thing. And so we would like to take this opportunity to explain to you why this was developed and how best to use it, and how to make this process work for you at your institution. So the next slide, please. Any of you that didn't log on time to download the handouts, do a screenshot of this one so you can remember it later. You can't write that fast. But I will briefly talk about what is not eligible, and then Galen will talk about when you can use VVC. So you cannot change from a non-survival to a survival surgery, nor can you increase the degree of invasiveness. You cannot make a change which results in greater pain, distress, or degree of invasiveness. You can't change to a housing or location that's not part of your animal care program. You cannot change species, PI, study objectives, or make a change that impacts personnel safety. Those are clearly outlined in the notice that was submitted by OLA. If you would like to see the notice, it's available on the OLA website. So now I'll turn it over to Galen to talk about when can you use VVC.
Thank you, Molly. Yes, the 2014 notice actually did a number of things that I agree with Molly really helped with IACUC processes, and I think it really helped reduce a lot of burden. The bottom 4 items on the right-hand column are things that many institutions or IACUCs were already doing. The OLA notification simply codified these so that anything like an increase in animal numbers based on an IACUC-approved protocol or policy, a change in personnel other than the PI, correction of typographical and grammar errors, or updates to the funding agency or title were things people did, but the 2014 notice put these in writing, and that's great. The real game changer are the items in the top 3 rows of the right-hand column, and these are where the veterinarian, a designated veterinarian, is allowed to make changes. Now, these changes have to be approved by the IACUC, so the IACUC has an approved VBC policy that allows changes in anesthesia, analgesia, sedation, or some of the experimental compounds. Again, that it's already pre-approved. You can't go backwards and approve it after the fact, but you do have a list of analgesics, for example, that you could say these are approved by the IACUC, and maybe it's a veterinary formula, formulary. Many people actually do that. You can have the veterinarian approve a change in euthanasia to an AVMA euthanasia guidelines approved method. Again, the veterinarian can do this on the spot. It happens quickly, within minutes, not taking the week or so it would take to run an amendment through by even DMR. And you can also increase the frequency or the duration or number of procedures performed on an animal within, I'm emphasizing this, within the IACUC approved policy. So maybe I need one more blood sample from my macaque. I need a 1 ml blood sample. The veterinarian, if that's in your IACUC approved policy, could approve that blood sample without having to wait for an amendment to be approved. So this is really important. And it's important not only because of the efficiency it provides, but I think it actually improves the welfare of the animals, because we don't have to stop a study simply to go back and approve something as simple as a blood draw. So again, these are, as Molly said, this was a game changer.
At last week's webinar, one of the speakers said their experience with VBC is that it had opened pathways to communication between the PIs and the veterinarians. And I think that is key. And I was wondering if you had seen that at Georgia, where the increased communication between your scientists and your veterinarians.
I think that's happening. I see the PIs know that this policy is in place and know that all they have to do is make a phone call to the veterinarian, and they can get a change made to their protocol that allows them to keep moving forward. They don't have to stop and wait for an amendment to be approved. It does make the veterinarian more a member of the research team. I do think that happens, yes.
Yeah, I think it's critical they be seen as a member of the research team. So what would, if a principal investigator called you or one of your veterinarians and wanted to request a change, at what point would the veterinarian send it to DMR or full committee review?
Well, the most common would be that it actually falls outside our policy. So as you're developing your VBC policy, you need to, a couple things. One, you need to be careful that you don't make it so narrow that you become non-compliant by not following your own policy. The other is to recognize all of those items in the left-hand column. Those are things you cannot change by VBC. So that's probably the most common reason that VBC isn't used. But the veterinarian may make a call and say, no, this is a sample that is much more invasive. So I want to do a liver biopsy or something. Maybe the veterinarian says, no, I want the IACUC to know about this before I'm going to approve it by VBC.
So with the VBC, we have a tool that's been around 5 years now, but it's a great tool to streamline, facilitate research. It just has limits in its usefulness, and it's important for investigators to know what it can be used for and what it can't be used for.
And it's important to get, the IACUC needs to get that information out to the investigators, because I think this is a great way for the investigators to streamline things going through the IACUC.
So this is a good slide to share with the rest of the institution. Okay, let's move to the next slide, please. Molly, I understand there are some issues regarding frequency of IACUC review of protocols. Can you give us a brief background? Just keep the webinar moving here.
Right, the various surveys run by the FDP have shown that right after the initial protocol review and approval process, the most irritating thing to the faculty are the annual and triennial or frequency of re-review. So those of you in the audience using lab rats, lab mice, zebrafish, and cold-blooded animals may be interested to know that annual review of these studies is not required unless the work is funded by the Department of Defense. Those of you using animals in projects not funded by the NIH or NSF may be interested to know that a triennial review is not required by federal regulations. And neither an annual nor a triennial review is required for those of you working with agricultural animals in agricultural research. And none of the above require a report from the scientists. So with that background information, let's see where you all can contribute to the conversation about change at your institution. So next slide, please. The first is the USDA requirement that the IACUC shall conduct continuing review of activities covered by this subchapter at appropriate intervals as determined by the IACUC, but not less than annual. This is a USDA requirement. This requirement applies to USDA-covered species and DoD-funded protocols only. That means those of you who are doing rabbits, dogs, cats, guinea pigs, hamsters, non-human primates are subject to this requirement. The rest of you are not. Public Health Service has no requirement for annual review, and there is no requirement for the PI to submit a report. As the regulation above says, the IACUC shall conduct a review. It doesn't say the PI must submit a report. So I'm going to turn it over to Galen on ways to accomplish what the USDA expects in the way of continuing review.
Thank you, Molly. It is true. I very strongly believe that IACUCs are always reviewing protocols. Things like post-approval monitoring, our semi-annual inspections to labs and to animal facilities, the constant presence of our IACUC members and our veterinarians in the animal facilities, as well as laboratories doing invasive procedures, they're constantly there. And we get, as an IACUC, we get reports back from the veterinarians, the animal care staff, the vet techs on things that are going on in the animal facilities and in the laboratories all the time. So there is a constant review of protocols. When an amendment comes through, we don't just look at the amendment, we look at the amendment in relation to the entire protocol. So from my perspective, we are always looking at active protocols. Now, there may be an inactive protocol that nobody's doing anything on, but that is not something that we're really concerned about. We're talking about those protocols where animals are actively being used, and there is a constant review of those procedures.
Yeah, I wanted to add that most of the places that still require an annual report from the PI are gathering information from that report, which is why they say they still need the report. So the conversation that you as a scientist can have with your institution is, what information are you gathering, and is there a better way to get the same information without requiring an annual report that's not required?
So let's look at the next slide. We have the results from the survey, and 47% of the institutions have eliminated this annual review for non-USDA species and non-DoD protocols. But 42% of the institutions are not planning to make this change, even though this activity is not required. So, like you say, Molly, this could well be a very good topic of discussion between researchers and the IACUC moving forward in those institutions. Let's move to the next slide. So this is a slide again from the Federal Demonstration Partnership Survey, and it's a drill down of specific IACUC issues. And if you read the different titles on the bars, you see that the top 7 issues related to the IACUC had something to do with protocol review process, with the top issue being the 3-year rewrite of IACUC protocols. So, Galen, I'm not sure you've seen these data, but with these 7 topics revolving, or 7 lead issues revolving around protocol review, how's that strike you? What are your thoughts when you see that?
Well, I share, since I do have active protocols, I believe, that I have to write. I'm working on one right now. The 3-year cycle is a little frustrating. It doesn't correspond to the length of grants. So many NIH grants are 5 years long. So I'm in the middle of my 5-year project, and now I'm getting a note saying you need to rewrite your entire IACUC protocol and resubmit it for review. That is an issue. So I share the frustration with some scientists who do that. Now, things that IACUCs can do is simply clone their approved protocol over and review that. Basically, take most of the burden off of the PI. The IACUC still has to review it, so there's still the IACUC burden that's there. So that those are things that can happen. Now, I'm also aware that there are software issues that make that cloning a little difficult sometimes. Hopefully, that will become better as time passes. That software will allow us to clone those protocols and move them over. It's also a time for, I do think it is a good time for the PIs to take a look at protocols, which they should be doing all the time. Some of the places that hang up protocol review, as I'm looking through this, turnaround time for applications and, that the PIs get hung up are considerations that the IACUC pays close attention to. So things like, if you're doing invasive or infectious disease studies, what are the endpoints for those animals? Give a lot of thought to that. Don't just say, well, when the animal looks sick, we'll euthanize it. Well, what does look sick mean? Pay attention to the animal numbers. Are they appropriate? And I will say that in the 20 plus years I've been an IACUC chair, I can't remember one time we've turned a protocol back because they asked for too many animals. At almost every IACUC meeting, we have a lengthy discussion about whether enough animals are requested for the studies that are being proposed. So, 1, request the appropriate number of animals and make sure your experimental design is clear. That doesn't mean you have to lay out every experiment, but let the IACUC know what your design is like so we can assess how many animals or roughly how many animals you're going to use. And as we heard last week, think of ranges of animals that you would use, not specific numbers. I do think that would help move things through the IACUC a little better. The other thing that sometimes hangs up animal use protocols is the lay summary, and you'd think that would be simple, but all too often we'll see somebody basically copying their NIH abstract over into the lay summary box, and that really confuses the committee, particularly some of our community members or our non-scientist members, and results in the protocol being sent back for revision. So, work with the veterinarians, work with the IACUC administrators to get your protocol in shape before you submit it, would get it through the process a lot faster.
So those are some really good tips to investigators of how to focus their protocol on animal welfare issues and not the science.
Yes, that's a great, we want to know what you're going to do with the animals. We think your science is great, but we're really focused on what you're going to do with the animals.
Yeah. So next slide, we see actually the results from the report again, and 33% of the institutions did not require a protocol rewrite at 3 years. However, 52% of the institutions continued to plan to require this rewrite, even though it's not required. So, this may be why, from the FDP survey, investigators thought this was a particularly onerous activity. Molly, do you have anything to add on this one?
Yeah, as the slide says, the last line, this triennial review requirement applies to PHS and NSF-funded projects only. I personally, or honestly, don't know of a university that does not require the triennial review. Michigan State University is discussing this, has actually been discussing this for maybe 10 years, and now our commercial software is going to necessitate that we make a decision. I have heard IACUC administrators or IACUC members say that the 3-year rewrite forces the PIs to stop and rethink what they're doing. And personally, I think the PIs stop and rethink what they're doing all the time. They are not waiting for this 3-year opportunity. So I hope some of you can have positive discussions at your institution about this not required, but in many ways beneficial practice.
It kind of gets back to what Galen had talked about earlier about how programs are continuously reviewing the program.
Well, I'm not a scientist, but you two are, and I believe the scientists are constantly looking at their science and what they're doing.
Absolutely. It's changing all the time.
Okay. So what's the actual policy here? I think that's in the next slide.
The actual policy is PHS. The IACUC shall conduct continuing review of each previously approved ongoing activity, including a complete review in accordance with 4C 1 through 4. What you really need to look at is 4C 2 A through G. But again, it says ongoing activity. That's what you need to be reviewing. A rewrite of the protocol is not required, nor does it require a brand new submission. It requires a continuing review of each previously approved ongoing activity. So I'm going to turn it over to Galen to explain about it's not a new project. All you PIs that sitting in the audience know it's not a new project.
Yeah, as I pointed out earlier, we're constantly reviewing protocols, and protocols are constantly being updated, amended. It's not something that happens only once every 3 years, and there's a list of things that you could do, and actually are ongoing all the time. Updates, obsolete information being removed. So the protocol that's active at the end of this 3-year cycle could easily be, in my opinion, be cloned over and just reviewed by the IACUC and approved.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next slide, animal numbers. And the survey showed us that 44% of the institutions allow for an approximate number or a range of animals to be used in the study. But 44% of the institutions also do not plan to implement this change. Now, this is an interesting issue. Both the USDA and the Public Health Service require only an approximate number of animals to be used or a range of animals to be used. Yet institutions have evolved to this, requiring exact numbers of animals in each group and each study with power analyses. It seems like we've become focused on the precision of the number of animals to be used, knowing exactly how many, while missing the point of accuracy. What's the right number of animals to be used? So, Galen, what's your perspective on this issue? What do you think?
Well, as I said earlier, I believe you need to look at ranges of animals. You also need to consider, what type of experiments you're doing. I do a lot of neuroscience research, which involves stereotactic surgery. If I'm trying to hit a small nucleus in the brain, that may be that I only am successful at that 70% of the time. You need to take that into account. So if you're proposing a group of 5 animals and 60 to 70% of them are successful, all of a sudden you have a project that is really horribly underpowered, and it will not produce rigorous results, and it's important to do that.
This is also an area where the 3 R's, reduction, replacement, and refinement, takes head on the issue of rigor and reproducibility and having enough animals in each group to be able to say with some certainty that your results are correct. How do we manage that?
Well, I'm going to lean to the side of having, rigorous studies that provide reliable data. If we have underpowered studies that do not provide reliable data, you might make the argument that we've not used those animals effectively. In fact, those studies would be really inappropriate. Those are the discussions we actually have as an IACUC when we're dealing with underpowered studies. Recognizing that there are sometimes reasons that you do have fewer animals per group. It might be related to the species being studied, the availability of a certain strain of mouse or something. But the investigator needs to take that into consideration and explain to the IACUC why they think their study will produce a reliable outcome.
Yeah. One more question. The option here is approximate number or range of numbers of animals to be used. What do you think might be the better approach of the two? It's not that one's right or wrong, but have a single approximate number or somewhere between X and Y.
I like the number between X and Y, simply because that gives us a little bit of room to add animals to a project without having to come back through with an amendment, or even though it's by DVC, you still have to go through the machination of doing that.
Yeah. So this is an area where investigators, through the regulations and policies, have a lot of leeway, right? And we need to be able to find ways to realize that leeway so that the quality of science improves along the way.
And as Molly highlighted, as she went through this slide, approximate numbers are appropriate to include in your protocols.
Yeah. Let's move on to literature search. Thanks for your comment. So the next slide shows literature search category for D&E procedures, and it's those procedures with potential for pain and distress. The results of the survey indicated that 25% of the institutions have eliminated the requirement for a literature search for category D&E, i.e. potential for pain and distress, for non-USDA species. This is a USDA.
It's a USDA.
62% of the institutions don't plan to implement this change at all. So that's interesting because it is a USDA specific requirement. The value of the literature search has been discussed for a very long time.
Since the requirement came out.
Yeah, I think so. And while it's only required for USDA, COGR respondents are still hanging on to the literature search. So I'm going to turn to you again, Galen. Scientists do literature searches all the time. Every time we write a grant, every time we write a manuscript, lots of times in between. What do you think scientists should be discussing? I mean, if we're arguing against a literature search, how should we be approaching this?
Well, thanks, JR. I think personally, as I look at protocols, I see lots of evidence in other parts of the protocol that tell me that the scientists know what they're doing. They're asking appropriate questions. They're referring back to other literature, their previous studies. So as you rightfully point out, they're constantly doing literature searches. They're the expert in their area. The rare occasion that shows up, you see it in other parts of the protocol that somebody on the committee recognizes that there's an inappropriate use of a technique or something. Most IACUCs know what the researchers are doing. Again, we're constantly following their projects. So I see lots of evidence in the other parts of the protocol that allow us to make this determination. And I would be very happy personally just to have the scientists tell us that, based on our experience and our search of the literature over the years, we know this to not be duplicative or redundant.
So rolled into that is the issue of pain and distress, minimizing pain and distress, the duplication of work, alternatives. So what you're saying is this can be done in an effective narrative and probably be more useful to the committee.
And yes, The pain and distress issues, again, those are issues that come up in other parts of a normal protocol.
Yeah.
And so we see how they're addressing the pain and distress. There's a surgery. Are they using analgesia? Okay, that isn't in the literature search. That's down in the surgery section. We see that, and so we know they're addressing it appropriately.
Yeah.
So there's lots of evidence there
Yeah.
for the issues that the literature search is supposed to address. And for those of us who've been on IACUC a long time, I haven't done it in recent months, but I have taken the search terms in the literature search and plugged them into PubMed, and you get all sorts of weird and wonderful results when you do that. I don't think they really address the issue that is trying to be addressed by the literature search.
Okay. Well, there was another part to this question, and that is literature search for category C. And although we've talked about this extensively, we'll show the results in the next slide. And I think this shows that the respondents are willing to give a little more latitude towards category C, as one might expect. 62% of the institutions eliminated the requirement for a literature search for category C procedures of non-USDA involved species, while 28% are still hanging on to it. So even with category C, we see a significant contribution. So Naomi, I think we've just about covered the topics that we set out to cover. I'll turn it back to you to manage the question and answer period. And I'd like to thank our contributors, Molly Green and Galen Petwitz.
Yes, thank you all so much. I mean, I was just getting sucked into it. Every time I hear a conversation on this, I learn something new. And so I appreciate all of you for your wonderful expertise and just kind of putting to rest some of the confusion that are still swirling around out there in the community. So we will now move on to our question and answer series. So as a reminder, to ask a question, just simply type in your question here in the white box and then click send, and we will receive it here. And I will begin going through that now. Okay. Let's see. The first question, were the same number of responses collected for each category of administrative burden? So I'm guessing this is in regards to the COGR survey.
Yeah, so as I recall, there were somewhere out of the 94 responses, the lowest number of responses were like 92. So
it was pretty,
yes, it was pretty similar across all of them.
Okay, great. Second question, many items listed as VVC review appear to be administrative to me, not major changes. And she gives examples, change in personnel other than PI. I'm guessing she's just trying to clarify.
Those changes have been allowed all along. In this case, OLA simply codified changes that can be made, these minor changes.
Gotcha. So minor changes, yeah. And as Molly mentioned, that entire table is really good to keep it in your back pocket. How are the changes to the protocol documented if VVC is used?
Great question.
That's a great question.
Our standard is that the veterinarian communicates that to either the attending veterinarian or the IACUC administrator. So it's in the form of an email or a memo.
Okay.
So that's documented, and then that goes on in our case, goes on a list that the IACUC sees at every meeting.
Gotcha.
So we have a list of VVC approvals that happen in that past month.
In our case, the request to change is initiated by the PI.
Okay.
In writing some way, even an email will suffice.
Okay.
And then the veterinarian follows up, and there's your documentation.
Gotcha. Right, but there is documentation.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, because the documentation is critical.
Of course, right. Okay. This is also relating to VVC. Are we to understand that changes in personnel, other than the PI, corrections of typos and or contact information now require a VVC? We used to approve these administratively. I think there's a misunderstanding there.
Right, because they are allowed administratively.
Yes, this is
Simply
allowed.
was being codified that this is allowable.
Right. So now it's just in writing, this is what you are and are not
So
allowed.
those would not require that process that both of you just described.
Right.
No.
The IACUC staff can make those changes automatically.
Okay. If a veterinarian approves a modification using VVC, but the change is not something previously approved by the IACUC, is this non-compliance?
Well,
I'm going to
that gets back to what Galen was talking about on, you have to have an institutional policy on how you're going to manage VVC. And if yours is really tight and very, specific, then this could happen, and it would be non-compliant.
Mm-hmm.
So it's better to have a broad policy and have where the veterinarians can quickly access the policy to determine if whatever they're reviewing is covered.
But still making sure that it doesn't bleed over into those non-eligible areas.
Right.
And I think on the first webinar, Sally had mentioned that there is some templates that institutions have implemented that people have used and are effective. So if you go back to the FASEB website, we do have those slides available and you can access those templates. Okay, next question. How are VVC approved modifications supposed to be incorporated into the protocol?
At Michigan State, we have an online commercial software, and the PIs will write it right into the protocol.
Yeah, we don't have, at the University of Georgia, we don't have the online or the commercial software, but the responses are documented and appended to the protocol. Again, it's important to document this has happened.
Absolutely,
Right.
document this happened.
Okay. This is regarding literature search. What about an updated literature search for the 3-year rewrite?
There's no requirement for a 3-year rewrite.
Which
Can be
is what we
cloned.
discussed, right?
Yes. And the literature search, I'm glad they asked this question. If you're using USDA species, you do have to repeat the literature search.
Right. But only USDA
Only
species.
USDA.
Right.
So that would be required annually.
No, at the 3-year rewrite is when the literature search has to be repeated.
Okay.
This is an important thing for the IACUC staff to know so that they're monitoring that this happens.
I'm going to go ahead and address this because I bet several people have this. Yes, the recording and the slides will be available from today. Last week's is already up on our website. You can listen to that recording as many times as you want, and this will be up on the website in the next few business days, so stay tuned. Okay, next question. If you have a protocol with over 20 amendments approved over the first 3 years, how do you not rewrite the protocol at the 3-year renewal if over 50% of the work has been completed?
This is an excellent question. And as long as I've been at Michigan State since 2005. And it was until recently a Word document. The PIs went right into the Word document and amended the Word document.
Oh.
So the amendments are in there. At that time, they were to take out stuff they were no longer going to be doing. So the protocol was always active and reflected the most current what is being done in that lab.
Oh, that's
Does that
smart.
make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
And our commercial software, it's the same way. They are modifying into the body of the protocol. At the 3-year point, when they clone, it will be the current version of the protocol, at which point they can go in and make more changes if they like.
Gotcha.
That makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
They're not attachments, so to speak,
Right.
like back in the day.
Gotcha.
I think that's the way most commercial software packages are using it. It's incorporating right into the protocol. It sounds like this one, they were amended, and so I do want, as an attachment, and I do understand why that institution, it would make sense to have them actually come back and maybe rewrite the protocol so it's clear and not muddled by 20 plus attachments to your protocol.
Okay, the next question is, you cited the literature search as a requirement for Animal Welfare Act species. My understanding is that lit searches are in the Animal and Plant and Health Inspection Service guidance, but not required. Please explain your use of the word required.
That's a really, really excellent question for which some of us have challenged USDA APHIS on. It is in a policy 11, they describe what they consider to be procedures with the potential for pain and distress. And then in policy 12 is where they introduce the requirement for this lit search. It does not agree with the Animal Welfare Act itself. Those of you may know, many of you may know that all of the animal care policies are under revision right now. You can look for and expect changes.
Right. And that will go on regs.gov for comment before it.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Okay. For DMR, it was mentioned about the quality of the reviewer other than IACUC training. Is there regulatory requirements for reviewer qualifications? Specifically, I wonder if a veterinarian is required, or could veterinary staff be used as well, or instead?
That's a great question, though. No, it is a really good question. Certainly on IACUC, there are scientists who are knowledgeable in broad areas. We try to have, actually I think most IACUCs I see have representation from all parts of the university, so all departments that are using animals. So there's an opportunity to assign a designated member reviewer who probably has a good background in that area. I can't think of any place that doesn't have a veterinarian review the protocols.
Yeah.
So the veterinarians are always reviewing protocols. They tend to focus more on the veterinary issues, maybe not some of the more scientific issues, but they are focused on veterinary issues. Places do have veterinary staff on the IACUC, or they can ask for ad hoc if they have a veterinary technician who is well qualified in husbandry of primates, for example, ask them to review a protocol that involves a primate study. So that's perfectly.
But are there IACUCs that defer to veterinary staff other than veterinarians to do the protocol review?
Veterinary technicians.
Yeah.
I'm not aware. I've not seen that.
But is it
in conjunction with a veterinarian, it's not forbidden. There's no requirement for a veterinarian to review a protocol.
I think that's the key question here.
Everybody recommends you have somebody, a veterinarian or somebody with that training, review a protocol, yes?
Yes, you're right. And that's my experience as a veterinarian is always reviewing the protocols. The requirement for that, though, I don't know where that would be.
I did visit one institution where it's a rodent protocol, veterinarian never looked at it.
Mm-hmm.
Really?
Until these site visitors said, wait.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Okay. Regarding VDC, if the IACUC has pre-approved a standard procedure library, can those SPs be added by VDC as long as the pain and distress is not increased?
If the procedure was already on the approved protocol. You could not add a procedure.
Of course.
Yeah. And that's an important distinction. Even though I have, a standard protocol within the library that the IACUC has approved, if it wasn't approved for your protocol, it can't be approved by VDC. So it has to be something that's in your protocol already, and then fits within the guidelines of your VDC policy.
Right.
Like your protocol says you want to do 5 blood draws, but for some reason you need to do a 6.
Mm-hmm.
You can add that.
Gotcha. Right.
The blood draw was already in your protocol.
Mm-hmm.
Right. You just need another sample.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. That was, I need to go back down.
Actually, we should go back and clarify that one about triennial review.
But I think I accidentally, it was down here.
Do you remember what it asked, JR?
Yeah, the listener thought they heard that triennial reviews weren't required. What we were actually saying is triennial rewrites are not.
Triennial review is only a PHS requirement. It is not required for any other activity.
Okay,
Any
here's
activities
the question. I thought I heard that triennial review was not required, but that doesn't seem consistent with PHS policy 4C5. Could you elaborate on the efficiencies we can apply to triennial review?
Triennial review is only required for PHS and NSF funded work. That is the only time it's required. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that answer that question? And could you elaborate on the efficiencies that we might apply to triennial review? The greatest efficiency in my mind is to clone the protocol, not ask the PI to rewrite the protocol.
Right.
And then for the committee members themselves to look at Roman numeral 4, letter C, 2, items A through G.
Mm-hmm.
Those are what you have to consider in the triennial review, the 7 items listed there.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So just want to add one small caveat or detail here, and that, you say it's only required for PHS and NSF. It's required for NSF because of the
PHS
memorandum of understanding that NSF has with Public Health Service.
Right.
So any other agency, any other group that has a similar memorandum of understanding or may have in the future would also require this.
Thank you. They require it by virtue of the MOU, not the regulation itself.
We do have a comment from NIH OLAW that clarifies some of this and says the OLAW guidance does not include administrative changes such as adding personnel, typographical changes, etc. as requiring VVC. These are administrative only. And OLAW says thank you.
Then we say that these codify that these are administrative, yeah.
Do VVC changes Do VVC changes ultimately go through an amendment if the team continues to use the changes?
No, that's the beauty of this VVC. It is from then forward incorporated into your protocol.
Gotcha.
There are other one-time issues, and Galen can talk about that, a one-time clinical need while the animal's on the bench.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there could be a need for a drug that you need to add during surgery, and you realize that has to happen. You contact your veterinarian, that's approved. Again, that really falls into a welfare issue. So VVC not only improves efficiency for getting changes approved, but it also can be used to improve the welfare of the animal.
So that would be a standard of care issue.
And it could easily fall in that standard of care. And you know, those of us who've been on IACUC long enough, that's always been a really great area. When somebody comes to you and says, especially the veterinarians, you know, we have an animal that has an issue, what can we actually do?
Right.
Is that going to fall in the area of needing an amendment for the science, or does that come under a veterinary care issue?
Yeah.
In which case, I think most IACUCs will fall on the side of the animal welfare and push it to the veterinarians to deal with.
Gotcha. We are running a little short on time, so we will not be able to get through every question. So we will take one more and then wrap things up. As a reminder, all of these resources will be available online, and I will have my email address up here in the next slide that you can easily just email me, and I will be happy to forward your question on to our experts here. Okay, last question. If you allow investigators to clone their protocol for 3-year renewal, how do you determine there is no unnecessary duplication of work?
Well, if you wanted to, you could ask that question of the PIs.
To make it
It's up to the PI to give you an affirmative statement. This is not necessary. This is not unnecessarily duplicative. So you just ask the PI to restate it.
Right.
So I understand that they're duplicating their own work. Some of that,
but they're not. They're continuing their own work.
They're continuing their own work. You know, you could, I suppose, make that same argument once they've completed their first year. So, you know, they have, most investigators, most approved animal protocols are for procedures, and then, you know, investigators will, that I know, use the same procedures year after year, and it just goes with numbers. So,
let me
asking a little bit different question.
Yeah, well, and I'll just add one thing about that, and that is sometimes it's important for investigators to duplicate part of their work. You know, so for example, if their animals have been moved from one facility to another on campus, they need to assure themselves that the controls and the treated groups are responding the same way.
That's true.
So in terms of duplicative, technically maybe, but scientifically essential.
Right.
Yes.
That's an important thing because the phrase is unnecessarily duplicative.
Right.
Excellent point.
Right.
Mhm.
Yes, Molly, that's a great point.
Mhm.
Naomi, thank you.
Thank you, everyone,
thank you.
and thank you to all of our listeners, and please feel free to reach out. I'm Naomi Harlan-Bacchus. I work here at FASA. Please feel free to email me. And again, thank you all for your participation and to our speakers here today. Thank you. Bye-bye.